This is a presentation to provide an overview of the Neighborhood Assistance Program for Education application for the program year 2021-2022. The application this year is very similar to last year's application. So if you applied last year, you should be fairly familiar with the way the application is structured. Just want to point out that on every tab, there is a link in the right-hand corner that shows a quick link to the help for each tab. As you're completing the tabs, if you're confused, you can click on the instruction link on the top right corner, and it'll take you to some information about that tab or how to complete it. The very first thing on the application is a tab called Forms. And at the top of the page rather, you will complete a couple questions, and it will tell you on the bottom which forms and documents need to be included in your application. It's important to note that not every organization has to complete every form. So based on your answers, your application will look different. Really important that you complete this so that you submit a completed application when you go to submit. So this should help you understand which forms and documents need to be included in your application. The first tab, tab A, is a tab that everyone will have to complete, and that's just general information about your organization. It's really important that you complete this, even if you've been in the program many years, because this information is what we will use when we format the contact list for this program year. And the people that you list on here are the people that will have access to our online system for submitting donations if you're approved. So it's really important that you have accurate information on there and that's fully completed. At the bottom, there's a box that says 12-month period used to calculate persons served. You have three choices for which 12-month period you want to use for calculating the persons served. You can do it based on calendar year, you can do it based on state fiscal year, or you can do it based on your organization's fiscal year. That said, if you've applied in the past, you need to use whatever 12-month period you used last time as the 12-month period you're using in this application. So if last year you did it based on calendar year, then this year you also need to do it based on calendar year. If you need to switch for some reason, please reach out to us. We can talk about that option. But ideally, you'll use the same 12-month period that you used in prior applications if you're a returning applicant. If your application includes indirect services through the provision of revenue, you must select the organization's fiscal year as your 12-month period. Very few organizations will actually be providing indirect service, but if you are one of those organizations that thinks you need to include indirect service to qualify, please let us know if you have any questions, because the application is slightly more complex if that is the case. Tab B is the person served tab, and that's where you're going to tell us the total unduplicated number of people receiving any service directly from your organization. And then below that, you're going to tell us the total unduplicated number of low-income persons or eligible students with a disability who received either scholastic instruction, scholastic counseling, scholarships other than the EISTCP scholarships, and at the very bottom, you're going to provide any other services that are not one of those education services. And for each of those, we ask for a very brief description. Now, I just want to remind you, this is not a grant application, so you don't need to justify or provide any background information on the services provided. We just need a few sentences on what kind of services you're providing. All of these counts should be unduplicated. So if the same person received all of the services, they should only be included in one of the categories. And that's true for the very first line, which is the unduplicated number of people who received any service. So if somebody received 50 services, there's still only one person. You're only going to count them once. Tab C is the revenue tab, where you provide some information about your organization's total revenue and total expenses, and those should come directly from your audit, review, or compiled financial statements for the most recent fiscal year. Those first two boxes should be just copied directly off of the audit or review. And then there's a box that says, this is where it gets a little complicated, of the total expenses above, the amount included in prior applications that was invested for future use. The future use whole thing is very complicated, and if you are using that, you might need to reach out to us for some more guidance, but I will provide a little bit of information about that. And then you're going to tell us how much of your expenses were used to provide direct service in scholastic instruction, scholastic counseling, scholarships, or any other non-education service. And then I want to draw your attention here to the bottom. The bottom two cells are really, really important. So that's going to be the total revenue received via donations that did or would qualify for neighborhood assistance tax credits that was used to provide education services. And then you need to tell us the total qualifying donations you anticipate getting in the upcoming program year. That's really important because those are the numbers we're going to use to calculate your tax credit allocation. That's the starting point for your tax credit allocation. Is going to be the amount of those, the lesser of those two is the number we start with. So really, you need to pay attention to those and make sure you put an accurate number in there. We don't want you to undersell yourself and say you need fewer credits than you need, but at the same time, if you tell us every year you need 300,000 in credits and you only ever use 80,000, please revisit that, because it's important that we make an accurate allocation, because at the end of the year, we then have to reallocate those credits. And it's a complex process that is unnecessary if we can just get people to be as accurate as possible when they anticipate how many donations they'll need for how many credits they'll need for the upcoming year. So to go back to that revenue invested for future use, the reason we have to do that is because the Code of Virginia says, as part of the qualifying criteria for an organization, that at least 50% of a neighborhood organization's revenue shall be used to provide direct services to low-income persons or eligible students with a disability. Because it says 50% of the organization's revenue and not 50% of the organization's expenses, there could be a situation, and we have an example here, where let's say you had $100,000 in revenue, you spent $45,000 providing services. Now, if all of that $45,000 was being used to provide services to low-income people, you still wouldn't qualify, because 45,000 is less than 50% of 100,000 in revenue. So in order to qualify in that situation, we would then allow you to say, well, there's $55,000 that was not used. That revenue was, we can say that was invested or set aside for future use to serve eligible people. So what you would do is say, well, a portion of that is set aside and we're going to use it next year. You know, we're going to use it. So that allows you to say that it was used. But by doing that, so basically we would add that back in and say, oh, we set aside this money. Now we're at 50,000. 50,000 is 50% of 100,000 and you qualify. The downside to that is if you do that in the next year, when you spend the revenue, we subtract it out because we've already counted it as used when you invested it or set aside in this year. And then I know this is super it's really, you can get in a cycle where it's very confusing. So the key to this is to remember that what you want to do is set aside, if you have to do this, you want to set aside the smallest amount possible to get to 50%, because next year it's going to be taken out. So in this example, if you had set aside the whole 55,000, right, then you would say 100% of revenue is used this year to provide services. Now, next year, we're going to take out 55,000 of whatever you spent because we already counted it as invested. So there is no value to having more than 50%. You know, as long as you get to 50%, you qualify. So don't need to show us that it's 100% of your revenue is going to be used. You just need to put aside enough. You just need to report enough to get over that 50% threshold. Now, if you have to do this and you haven't done it in the past, absolutely feel free to reach out to us. You can email us at tax.credits@doe.virginia.gov. That's tax.credits with an S at doe.virginia, the whole word Virginia.gov. So if you have questions about this, feel free to reach out. It can be very confusing. So tab C is where you're going to report that if you've done this in the past. If you've set aside revenue in the past, this is where you're going to report how much of that revenue was spent in the current year. So sometimes you might set aside $100,000 and it might be spent over the next 3 years. So in the first year, you might spend 40,000 and 30,000, whatever. So it doesn't, you don't have to spend it all in the next year, but if when you spend it, we have to take it out. So that's where you complete tab C1 to report prior future use revenue. And that's a confusing sentence even of itself. You would just put in a description of where the revenue, when the revenue is invested and how it was spent. And then in one of those categories, it's going to be scholastic instruction, scholastic counseling, or scholarships, or any other service. So that's what C1 is. And then C2 is where you would set it, where you would be reporting future revenue on your current application. So in an example here, let's say the organization had 100,000 in revenue, and they had spent 75,000, but they have so they have 25,000 remaining. They could say, well, we spent 15,000 on scholastic instruction, and at the bottom there's a little table where you would sort of give us a breakdown of how it was invested. If it was actually invested in a fund, then we want the date that it was invested. If it was just set aside, then you can just pick the first day of the month that you did that. We don't have to be that granular with it. And just a really, really brief description of what it was used for. Okay, so tab B is about affiliated entities. An affiliate in the code language is really any organization or is any organization or person that is directly or indirectly controlled by the applicant. So that means if you have the same board, if you have some sort of connection to another organization, then the affiliate organization also needs to meet the 50% of revenue and 50% of people served to qualify. So for each affiliated entity, there's a little box on tab B that you would complete. You'd provide the name of the affiliate, the description of the relationship with the affiliate, and then you're going to do the exact same thing that you had to do on your application, which is the total number of people served by the affiliate and the total number of people served by the affiliate that are low income. Now, in this case, they don't have to be education because this is an affiliated entity. So they can be doing anything, but 50% of the people they serve need to be eligible for NAPE, which would be 300% of federal poverty or 400% of federal poverty if they're a student with an IEP. And then 50% of the revenue must be used to provide services to those same populations. Not that many organizations have this, but if you're confused about it, again, feel free to reach out to us and we can provide some more guidance. Then you have tab E, and this is where it's quite complicated. This is for indirect service. So if your organization granted revenue to another organization, you can use that revenue and those people served to qualify for the neighborhood assistance program for education. This only applies for education proposals. It does not apply if you're applying a DSS. So this is only for education proposals. But you can basically, you'd have to complete one of these for each organization that you provided revenue to, and you would provide a breakdown of the people served and the revenue you provided to those organizations. Another one where if you have questions about this, if you think you need to use this, feel free to reach out to us because it is quite complex. Again, so they provide the person served and the revenue provided to those organizations, really brief descriptions for each one. And then if you completed that tab, then you also need to get one of these forms that needs to be completed by your organization, the top section, and then the bottom section gets completed by the recipient organization that received revenue from you. And then it's signed. At the end of the application, there is a summary tab. There's nothing you have to do on this. It just sort of compiles all the information from the rest of the application. It's mainly what we use as a sort of a starting point for our review process, but you can just spot check everything in here to make sure you completed everything correctly. And then there is the assurance statement, which must be signed by the president, CEO, or executive director of your organization and submitted with your application. All the documents, with the exception of the assurance statement and the form that must be completed if you provide revenue to other organizations, should be as a Excel document. The two forms can be PDF, but please submit your application as a Excel document. All right, so that is all we have. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, tax.credits@doe.virginia.gov. This year's application is due by Monday, May 3rd, and it should be submitted by email, again, to tax.credits@doe.virginia.gov. And again, send it as an Excel with the PDF for the 2 forms. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or you run into something that you're confused by. So that is, I think, all we have for today. And I really appreciate you listening. And please feel, again, reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.